Welcome to the meeting of the San Diego Metropolitan Transit Systems Budget Development Committee. I'm your chair, Vivian Moreno, and welcome everybody. Clerk, please proceed with the roll call.
Moreno,
Present.
Goble,
Here.
McCann,
Present.
Montgomery Stepp,
Here.
Whitburn.
Here.
Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you. And if we could move on to item number 2, which is public comment. Are there any members wishing to speak?
Yes, we do, Chair. Alex Wong, if you could please unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. As data researcher for RAD-SD, I believe increasing green line frequencies to 7.5 minutes or better is crucial. Look at all the transit-oriented developments under construction in Mission Valley. Riverwalk Golf Course is being redeveloped into 4,300 homes and 1 million square feet of office. San Diego State is transforming the parking lot surrounding Snapdragon Stadium into 4,600 homes, 1.6 million square feet of office, classrooms, and labs, and a 400-room hotel. Westfield Mission Valley was recently sold to a developer who will redevelop the area into a mixed-use development with multifamily housing as well as retail. Mission Valley is becoming MTS's biggest ridership cash cow, but to really milk this cash cow, you need to maximize frequencies. 15-minute green line frequencies are not going to get people to switch to transit. You need at least 7.5-minute frequencies to make the green line convenient and time competitive with driving. Therefore, MTS ought to think twice before supporting an airport trolley which would merge onto Green Line tracks, creating a bottleneck that could permanently limit Green Line frequencies to 15 minutes. By contrast, the People Mover alternative would not share tracks with any existing trolley lines, thus freeing up trolley tracks and operators towards maximizing Green Line frequencies. Consider also that the People Mover will be automated, saving MTS operating costs, which is essential, given that MTS faces nearly $50 million annual operating deficits. The People Mover will also allow more flexibility. With the press of a button, MTS can instantly deploy more People Mover trains if there are large crowds flying into downtown for conventions and other events without having to worry about staffing shortages. The automation also allows MTS to easily provide 24/7 service. Thank you.
That concludes public comments.
Thank you. We will move on to item number 3, which is approval of the minutes for our meeting on April 23rd, 2024. But before we do, Clerk, are there any members who wish to speak on item number 3?
We have no public comments.
Okay, thank you. This is an action item, so if I may have a motion and a second.
So moved.
Moved by Mayor McCann. I am happy to second. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? And the motion passes unanimously. So we'll move on to our committee discussion items, which is item number 4. It's the fiscal year 2024 operating budget discussion. And I believe Mr. Meyer is here. Feel free to take it away.
Good afternoon. My name is Gordon Meyer. I'm the manager of financial planning here at MTS, and this wanted to provide an update on our FY25 budget development process, including a discussion on the recent news regarding our Senate Bill 125 funds. So I wanted to provide a brief overview first. So we presented an initial draft of the FY25 operating budget to the board of directors on April 25th. Since that time, we've continued to make revisions to the budget, and we had formulated a final draft that we planned on bringing to this meeting and then to the board for final adoption on May 16th. However, on April 30th, staff were alerted that the SB 125 funds at the state were currently being frozen. For MTS, we were expecting an initial deposit of $136 million by the end of April, and that was per the published draft guidelines. At that time, though, the state notified CTA, or the California Transit Association, that all SB 125 funds were currently being frozen for distribution to all the transit operators. And so for MTS, that has a significant impact. We have $284 million that was planned per the original legislation over multiple fiscal years. We had $211 million of that going to our operating budgets between FY24 and FY28. And then we had $72 million also planned for the capital budget between FY25 and FY28. And so not only does this news have a significant impact on our FY25 operating and capital budgets, but also our out years as well and our overall financial outlook in the near term. And so without this SB 125 support, the fiscal cliff is now approaching in fiscal year 2026. And so the agenda for this meeting is to review the final assumption changes that we had made since the prior draft. That'll give us our baseline budget to which any changes we make in response to this SB 125 news will be applied to. And then we also would like to look at a few different 5-year forecast scenarios. One of what it would have looked like if we had received all the SB 125 funds and what we were thinking things are going to look at like as of a week ago. And then we have a couple different views as well that reflect the new SB 125 news. So we'll go through those. And then we'd like to discuss some of the alternatives that we've identified and then reach kind of consensus on a recommended path forward. And then we'd also like to talk about the new budget timeline. We were originally trying to schedule an additional BDC meeting for May 30th. That is up for discussion. I don't think we're going to get that one scheduled, but we also need to move the public hearing that was planned for May 16th and move it to June 20th so we can pass a final budget before the start of the fiscal year. And so now we'll look at the few changes that we had made since the prior draft that was presented to the board. So on the revenue side, we made one change. We added $3 million to our TDA number in the operating budget. So we reached out to Sandag. We had touched on this in the prior presentation that we wanted to reach out to them and see if we could claim a more aggressive claim number. And so we did that, and we confirmed that we can claim an additional $3 million. So by increasing our claim amount by $3 million, we're now projecting 2.1% growth in TDA versus Sandag's original assumption of a negative 0.1% growth assumption. And so if the cash receipts come in closer to what we're claiming now, then we won't need to draw from the reserve at the county, which is a specific TDA reserve. If we do end up finishing the year closer to Sandag's number, then we would need to draw from the TDA reserve at the county. And so the only change to our subsidy revenue was the increase of $3 million for TDA. The other change here is to our reserves. So you can see there was a decrease in the projected reserves utilization of $790,000. That's because in this revised draft, we had added more revenue than we did expenses, and so our deficit was decreased by $790,000, meaning that our reserves needed to balance our budget went down by $790,000. And so our total revenues in this baseline draft were projected at $459.3 million, which was an increase of $2.2 million from the prior draft. So we also made adjustments to the expenses since the last version you saw. So for personnel, we added $3.7 million from the prior draft. $2.2 million of that was directly related to the salary study. And then we also refined our CalPERS assumptions. So the initial draft that we presented last time didn't reflect any of the headcount changes or the impact of the salary study. After getting the decision on the salary study, we did the full calculations where we reflected projected payroll that reflected not only the headcount changes, but also the salary study. The other significant change since the prior draft was in energy. So we reduced the budget here by $1.5 million since the prior draft. And that was all in the projected CNG commodity rate. We were budgeting $6.40 per decatherm in the prior draft. We're bringing that down all the way to $5 per decatherm. And that's based on discussions with our vendor regarding a fixed price proposal where they came in at $5.50 to fix that price for the entire year. That includes a significant risk premium. And then we also looked at our last 2 months of our own commodity expenses, which were below $3. So we think $5 is a very fair, not overly aggressive assumption now for FY25. And so in total, we're now projecting $459.3 million in expenses, which was an increase of $2.2 million over the prior draft. And so here you can see with these last minute changes incorporated, We had our recurring revenues increasing by 3 million, our expenses increasing by 2.2 million. So it's actually a slight reduction in our projected structural deficit of 790,000. With the one-time reserve activity and one-time funding included, we had a balanced budget that we were planning on bringing to the BDC and board. And so before we start moving on to the SB 125 news, we also wanted to give a 5-year projection of the baseline scenario as if everything had gone to plan and we didn't receive the news last week. And so what we do for the 5-year projection is we take our FY25 proposed budget, and then for the next 4 years, we make assumptions surrounding revenue, service levels, as well as expenses, and then we put those assumptions into a model, and then we try to do our best calculation of what the next 4 years are going to look like. And so on the revenue side, regarding passenger revenue, we had consistent growth, but still not returning to our pre-pandemic levels. So for FY25, we were assuming 7.5% growth over FY24. We assumed 7.5% again for FY26, and then we gradually had that going down to 6, 5, and then 4 as we scaled back the planned service increases just based on our original SB 125 plan. On the federal revenue side, which is primarily our preventive maintenance funds in the operating budget, we assumed steady growth at just over 2% per year. And then on the sales tax side, which is our TDA and Transnet revenue, we used the growth assumptions that were provided by Avenue, which is the third party that's used by Sandag. And they do have more aggressive assumptions than Sandag, but we also think they're more realistic. And then on service levels, so for the next 4 years, in this baseline projection, we included all of the added bus and trolley service that was built into our original SB 125 plan. We also assumed continued recovery of the ADA paratransit volumes, which is a demand-based service. So for the paratransit, we'd assume 10% growth in 26, 10% growth in 27. That gets us back close to our pre-pandemic baseline. And then we had the growth tapering off significantly after that point. And then in this forecast, there were no other changes to service levels. And then for expense assumptions, we have a variety of different categories that we apply to the line items in our budget. One of them is the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. So for that, we assumed 3.5%. So still pretty decent inflation in FY26, but then gradually going down to 3% in 27 and 28, and then down to 2.8% in FY29. For wages and benefits, we assumed 4.5% in 26 and 27, primarily based on the collective bargaining agreements proposals that we've seen as of late, and then going down to more typical growth of 3.5% in fiscal year 28 and 29. And then purchase transportation, that's our TransDev contracts for our fixed route bus service as well as our paratransit service. We know what the contracted rates are for those contracts, so we just blend that into the actual rate increase for each year. And then lastly, we look at the energy as well. And for that category, we look at the Department of Energy forecasts for electricity, natural gas, and oil. And then we layer on our assumptions for SDG&E growth, and then blend that into an overall energy factor. And then so we apply all of these assumptions to our model, and then you can see the bottom line, the overall average growth. So that's the actual projected expense growth by year. You can see fiscal year 26 is still pretty high at 7.2%. Main factor there is that that's the last year of major service increases in our SB 125 plan. So it's still heavily service driven in 26. And then you can see 27 through 29, we start to see that come down towards more typical annual increases just related to expense growth. And then so here you can see what that looks like in terms of actual figures. And so once again, was our baseline budget. This is what we were planning on bringing as of a week ago. And so you can see we start with our structural deficit of 87.8 million projected for FY25. We're balanced with our one-time activities. And then we're balanced in FY26 as well when we use the remaining 65 million of our operating deficit reserve. And then we also have 36 million in FY '26 of SB 125 funding. With both those, we're able to balance 26 and 27 is also balanced, but we have 110 million of SB 125 funds. And so even with this picture in where we receive all of our SB 125 funds, we were looking at hitting the fiscal cliff in very early fiscal year 28, where we would end the year with a true operating deficit, not just structural, of 79 million for FY '28. And so that's the baseline. So now I want to transition to what we think things are going to look like now, given our new assumptions and the uncertainty around SB 125. And before we start looking at our projections, we figured it's important to show exactly what's in our plan. So the table on the top that's our SB 125 plan for all the funds that are in the operating budget. And so you can see here we have 211 million in total that was planned for the operating budget. The different activities are listed above, highlighted by the service increases for bus and trolley, security enhancements. And then also important is that we had 75 million in that number just towards structural deficit balancing that would also be going away if we were not to receive these funds. And so of these activities, we still recommending with some of them, even if we don't receive the revenue. First, the security enhancements. We have 3.5 million per year. We've already started hiring. We also think there's a benefit there, not only in the obvious benefit of safety and security for our passengers, but also we think it could indirectly help our fare evasion rates. And then we also need to move forward with the Iris Rapid operations. One, we implemented it last October, so we don't want to pull that service back. And then we're also contractually obligated to operate it since the infrastructure was funded with a competitive TIRCP grant. So we are recommending, due to the uncertainty of the SB 125 funds, that we suspend or delay the rest of the remaining trolley and bus service increases. And then, as mentioned, the 75 million for structural deficit balancing is assumed that we would no longer receive. And so when we look at our FY '25 projected impact as well as the 5-year forecast, we need to remove all of the revenue related to these, but we'll leave some of the expenses in. And this obviously impacts the timing of the fiscal cliff significantly. And so here we wanted to look at how we think this new news is going to impact our FY '25 budget specifically, and then also how we are building it into our revised 5-year forecast that reflects this new situation as well. And so on the revenue side, we're reducing our passenger revenue assumption for FY '25 by 1.2 million. We're adding less service, so we think that's going to impact our projected fare revenue negatively as well. We're also reducing our projection for other income, specifically energy credit revenue, since we won't be operating as much service, we won't be consuming as much of the renewable fuels that we generate credits off of. And then we're also reducing our budget for interest revenue as well, because we were planning on a $136 million deposit that we were going to be generating interest on in FY '25 and beyond. On the expense side, we have about 20 million of expenses built into that original FY '25 forecast. 4 million for Iris Rapid operations are still included in this projection for the reasons mentioned on the last slide. We also propose leaving the 3.5 million for security enhancements in the budget as well. But if we pull out all of the other planned service increases and activities, then we net a reduction in expenses of 13.2 million. And so with the total revenue declining by 23 million from the baseline budget and expenses declining by 13 million, we have a net unfavorable impact in FY '25 of 10.1 million versus the prior draft. And so that means we would need to use an additional 10.1 million from the operating deficit reserve. So we'd use that reserve faster. And so for the 5-year forecast, we also reduce the assumption for passenger revenue as well as other income, just based on that adding back that extra service. And then on the expense side, we use the same growth factors that we had used in the baseline projections. So same assumptions for CPI, energy increases, et cetera. However, all the expenses related for those additional SB 125 activities that we'd be pulling back are removed. And so here you can see the first 5-year scenario that reflects the new SB 125 news. So in this one, we pull out all of the SB 125 revenue, and then we back out all of the extra activities that we don't plan on operating due to the uncertainty. And so you can see here we have a balanced budget in FY25. We use 31 million from our operating deficit reserve, and then just in FY26, we hit the fiscal cliff. We use all the remaining 51 million in our operating deficit reserve, and then we end the year with a $37 million true operating deficit. And then just a note on this slide is that if we were to take a budget today to the board to get passed, it would be the FY25 budget here. It is balanced. And then any action that we take to address the structural deficit would be applied either to an FY25 amendment or to the FY26 budget next year. And so now we see what it looks like regarding the new news, but without taking any action. So we kind of went back to the drawing board in identifying strategies for delaying the fiscal cliff, and below are the options that we identified. So one option is that we could shift 30 million of identified flexible funding from the FY25 capital budget to the operating budget. This would be a one-time transfer. And just important to note that these funds are currently allocated to specific projects. But what we mean by flexible funding is that the funding that's for those projects is not legally or contractually obligated to be used for a certain project. So it's not a competitive grant award that can only be used on one thing. Another option is to change our preventive maintenance sharing methodology between capital and operations. So we had touched on this in the prior presentation, but anytime we increase the amount of federal preventive maintenance funds in our operating budget, historically, we've always added TDA back to the capital budget to keep the capital budget whole. So if we evaluate that, we can pull 38 million per year out of the capital budget and transfer that to the operating budget. And then lastly, we could also look at our sharing for STA or state transit assistance. So typically we receive about 40 million per year. We put 11.3 million in the operating budget most of the time, and then the remainder goes to capital. We could look at shifting up to 20 million of that from the capital budget to operations. And then we want to make the point here that all the three options above that we just talked about, they have a significant impact on our capital budget, our ability to complete upcoming projects, maintain a state of good repair, and then also to complete things such as the zero emission bus transition, where some of these funds are currently allocated. And then some of the other options that we've covered in the other meetings, we could change the fare diversion program to increase compliance. We could look at a fare increase. We could be even more aggressive than rolling back service, and maybe we start reducing service to slow down the approach of the fiscal cliff. We've talked about the possibility of a ballot measure in November of 2026. Do we push for a new state sales tax? And then we're open to discussion on any other proposals as well. And then important to note that if we were to do all three of the top bullets, which all involve transferring funding from the capital budget to the operating budget, then we would be balanced through fiscal year 2027, and we'd hit the fiscal cliff in FY28. And so this scenario is what that looks like. And so you can see we have the structural deficit of 78.2 million in 25. That gradually grows. However, FY25 is still balanced with no action. FY26, we're able to balance in this scenario, but it involves transferring about 57 million from the capital budget to the operating budget. And then we're also able to balance FY27 as well. But we're also shifting another 58 million plus the one-time 30 million that we identified in the FY25 CIP. With all of those actions combined, we're balanced through FY27. And then we hit the fiscal cliff with a $29 million operating deficit projected for FY28. And so that brings us to the next steps. We've had some of these discussions preliminarily, just as with our unions and contractors, but we need to notify them of our intent to keep our service at its current levels. We also expect that the May revision of the state budget will be published by May 14th. We hope to receive clarification on the timing and amount of funds at that time. However, the final state budget won't be available until summer, and it's typically not until the last week of June. So that's after we need to have our budget passed. And so the plan is to present this same report to the board next week on the 16th, but updated with any new information. And then we planned on bringing this to a BDC on May 30th. That's up for discussion or still to be decided. And then we are also proposing to move the public hearing that was originally scheduled for next week to June 20th to allow us enough time to come up with our final budget that reflects the new situation. And then looking forward, we think we'll need to hold probably at least one budget development committee over the summer so that we can provide updated information, discuss strategy, and formalize our plan.
If I could, Gordon, I just want to update. We just got a media release from the governor's office that they're going to have the May revise out on Friday, so the 10th. So we'll know before next week's board meeting.
And so that brings us to the staff recommendation that the Budget Development Committee forward a recommendation to the Board of Directors to postpone the trolley 15-minute add-ons until the future of the SB 125 funding is known. And then also postpone the public hearing and implementation date for Route 910, which is the overnight border express. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. And before we go to committee member comments, are there any members?
We do have one comment. Alex Wong, when you please unmute yourself.
It is crucial for MTS to improve late night service to 15 minutes or better as soon as possible. 30-minute frequencies are unusable for many late night shift workers. 30-minute trolley frequencies means that they could easily miss their connecting bus home and be stranded at a transit stop for the night. 15-minute late night frequencies will fix that. It will ensure that anyone who begins or ends their shift during late nights or Sunday mornings anywhere on the trolley system will enjoy a basic level of service. It's also incumbent on MTS to deliver 7.5-minute mid-coast trolley frequencies as soon as possible. As University City steadily densifies, mid-coast trolley ridership will continue to rapidly grow for many years. Doubling frequencies will not only shorten trips and alleviate overcrowding, it will also help passengers feel safer because it reduces the time passengers spend waiting at stations and because most crimes on the trolley system happen at stations rather than on board the trolleys themselves. As soon as funding is identified, trolley frequency increases should be prioritized before bus service increases. Consider that the trolley lines are our region's busiest transit lines, meaning trolley lines have far lower subsidies per passenger than most bus lines. Ultimately, I have faith MTS will continue to work hard and identify SB 125 funding as soon as possible. Amidst this fiscal hardship, though, let's remember what makes MTS great. As MTS's Mark Olson says, superior service retention is the reason why MTS has enjoyed one of the nation's strongest post-pandemic recoveries. Let's continue to prioritize maximizing frequencies on trolley lines and the region's busiest bus lines and enjoy continued ridership growth for many years to come. Thank you.
That concludes public comments, Chair.
Thank you. I will open it up to my colleagues, starting with Councilmember Goebel. And if I may, this is an actionable item, so if I may have a motion in a second. Go
Okay.
ahead, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. The TransDev worker strike was in this fiscal year, is that correct? FY24? Because it was like last August or September
It was May and June, so it was the last 2 months of the prior fiscal
of the
year.
prior fiscal year. So FY24 is a clean year,
Yes.
so to speak. So we don't have to worry about, okay, you get the idea. The idea about switching capital funds, on the surface isn't a great idea because you're not continually updating your assets, trolleys, buses, things like that. But if your capital plan includes purchasing things that you may not need in the future, because you might have adjustments, then that's a good reason to shift money. So that's an idea or consideration on shifting capital money is, would we be spending money on something that we might not need in the future and we should move it to operations? So you get what I'm saying there. The idea of coming up with new revenues, uh, I like the idea of keeping the Iris Rapid. I like the idea of keeping the new security because the safety and security is paramount for our riders, and we shouldn't cut the momentum that we have gained in the past year really on hiring extra people to provide a safe environment for what we want to have going forward even more. So with that, I will make a motion to accept staff's recommendation.
Thank you. So there is a motion on the floor. Anybody else? Supervisor Montgomery-Stepp?
Thank you so much. I have a question quickly, and I think you did go over this in the presentation, but I'm looking at slide 6, the expense assumptions and the energy assumptions and that dip from 26 to 27. And I just wanted to know where that projection or assumption came from.
Yeah, so if we look at so you can see, if you look at the bus service enhancements line in our SB 125 plan, the third line from the top, you can see the projected spending on additional bus service goes up, it almost doubles. So we increased a lot of service in FY20 or planned for FY25, but then we also had a lot planned for 26 as well. So 26 is really the last year where we're adding a significant amount of service. 6. So that's why you see that the still really high expense growth in FY26, but then it levels out. And after that, the expense growth is just more due just to rate increases and general expense growth. But we don't have any large additions to service after that point.
Okay, and that applies to energy. Yes.
So essentially what we're saying is that the 8.6%, that's not a rate increase within energy, it's the total cost increase.
Okay.
So when we add in a bunch of service in 26, that essentially increases the cost by 8.6%. And then you have flat service levels into 27. So the only aspect of 27 that's increasing is really the rateable cost increase of the commodity itself.
And not the one-time costs that come along with adding.
Correct.
that
That's not
service.
the increased levels of service that were expected to take place in 26, if that makes sense.
Sort of. I'm just with those levels of service continuing. I just don't understand how we have a dip in the energy assumption if those services are continuing.
It's not a dip. What it's saying is that costs will continue to increase in fiscal year 27.
Okay, that's the increase.
But it will be just at
won't be-
3.7%,
got
which
it.
ties into the rate in which the commodity is expected to increase.
Okay. Thank you for that. That makes sense. Thank you. I, of course, am saddened. I was looking forward to a lot of the decisions, especially around frequency and routes that I had been hearing about prior to even being an elected official, and was finally seeing those things come on board with the additional SB 125 funding. I understand we're not there right now. We can hope and pray that the May revise says something different. But for now, I will second this motion to move it forward for a further discussion with the entire board and see where we go from here.
Thank you. So there's a motion and a second on the floor. Any other members wishing to be recognized? No. I want to take a moment to say a few comments. I think it behooves the budget committee to look at the capital versus operational budget. I know that a lot of the capital work that we do is for safety. So I would like to see that separated. it is gut wrenching to hear that, we would dip into our capital project, being that MTS has really been in the forefront of a lot of the innovations that are happening in the transportation industry. So it pains me as well, just to even say that, but I would like to take a look at that. The other point that, and if whenever sometime in the future, if we could see those numbers, the other thing that I'm assuming here, just based on the conversations we were having last year on the 125, there are other agencies in the state of California that are doing far worse than us. So it would be my assumption that the governor probably wants to take care of those agencies and leave the rest of us kind of to fend for ourselves. So I would ask this body and respectfully our chair, if we could start engaging some of our state legislators just to make sure that we are definitely in the conversation when they're discussing BART and other systems that are doing that are not doing well. I definitely don't want the Bay Area to be eating our lunch, and I know that our CEO does an amazing job. But if there's something that we could do locally with our legislators, we have great leaders that should be able to. I don't know what they do in Sacramento, but just make sure that we're at the table and we're not being, eaten for lunch or whatever. And so moving on, the uncertainty around SB 125 should give us pause in launching any new services too quickly. Once again, it just pains me to think about the overnight service, us postponing, and I like the word postponing as opposed to just completely eliminating. I do support staff's recommendation, though, to postpone it. I support the recommendation to support increases in trolley frequency. And, it's my hope that the state is not going to follow through with the potential cuts to the 125 funding. But if they do, as I stated earlier, I definitely want us to be at the table. Longer term, as I mentioned at our last budget development committee meeting, I think it's high time, and I would be supportive of MTS exploring a revenue measure to give us more financial independence moving forward for 2026. I think we need to shoot our shot and see if it lands. But we have that concludes my comments. We have a motion on the floor in a second. And so all those in favor, please say aye. All those opposed, please say nay. I don't hear any abstentions either, so the motion carries unanimously. And we're going to move on to item number 5, which is our next meeting date, which is to be determined. So this brings us to item number 6, adjournment. Thank you all for your attendance and your input today. The meeting of the MTS Budget Development Committee is now adjourned, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody. Thank you.